What if the person you've ignored for years turned out to be the smartest soul in the room? Today's story will shatter every assumption you've ever made about dignity, value, and hidden genius. This isn't just a lesson in math, it's a wake-up call for how we see each other. Stay with us until the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Hit like if you believe respect should be earned by heart, not by title, and subscribe now, because stories like this deserve to be heard. Evelyn Carter had walked the same halls of Lincoln High School for nearly 2 decades, always early, always quiet, always unnoticed. She was the kind of person who blended into the background, not because she lacked presence, but because most people simply never looked closely enough. Her days started before the sun was up. She would arrive with her cleaning cart, mop, and gloves, gently moving through the still dark corridors as the world slowly woke up around her. The echo of her footsteps was often the only sound in the school at that hour. She swept floors, wiped down windows, emptied trash bins, and scrubbed away the messes that came with hundreds of teenagers occupying the same space day after day. To most students and staff, Evelyn was just the janitor, the older black woman with graying curls and quiet eyes, always seen in her faded uniform and sturdy shoes. No one stopped to ask her how she was doing or if she needed help carrying something. They walked past her like she was invisible, sometimes whispering rude comments just loud enough for her to hear, assuming she wouldn't respond. Some students even smirked or rolled their eyes, thinking they were above her simply because they had books in their hands and she had a broom in hers. The teachers weren't much better. While they rarely said anything outright disrespectful, their glances carried subtle messages. They never greeted her with warmth or engaged her in any kind of meaningful way. Most saw her presence as a quiet necessity, someone to tidy up the mess without ever being part of the school's real life. Evelyn learned to live with that. She grew used to the silence, to being overlooked, and to carrying the weight of unspoken judgment every single day. Despite all of this, Evelyn took pride in her work. She didn't need praise or recognition to keep going. She worked with care, not just cleaning but tending to each space like it mattered. And in many ways, it did. She was the invisible thread that held the school's daily routines together. When no one else noticed, Evelyn was the one who stayed late to mop up after a spilled lunch tray or quietly replaced a broken locker handle before the first bell rang. She made sure every classroom was ready for learning, even if no one ever thanked her for it. What most people didn't know, what no one even thought to imagine, was that Evelyn had once walked very different hallways. Years ago, she had been a student at Columbia University, one of the brightest minds in the mathematics department. But dreams don't always survive the harshness of reality, especially for a young black woman coming from a poor family. Life had taken its toll. A family emergency, financial hardship, and the crushing weight of discrimination forced her to abandon her ambitions and find work to support those she loved. That's how she ended up at Lincoln High. What was supposed to be temporary became permanent. Still, Evelyn never complained. She carried herself with quiet dignity, day in and day out. And while others may have thought she was just a janitor, Evelyn knew better. She knew the value of hard work, the strength of humility, and the power of simply showing up. She also knew something no one else in that building could see. Not yet, at least. Beneath the uniform and the quiet demeanor, she still carried the mind of a mathematician, the heart of a dreamer, and the strength of someone who had weathered storms most people couldn't even imagine. Long before Evelyn Carter ever picked up a mop or wore a janitor's uniform, she had a different identity, one that few, if any, at Lincoln High School would have ever guessed. She was once a brilliant math student, full of promise and ambition. Growing up in a small working-class neighborhood, Evelyn had always stood out, not for how loudly she spoke or how much attention she demanded, but for the way numbers came alive in her hands. From a young age, she saw patterns where others saw confusion. Math wasn't just a subject to her. It was a language she understood deeply, instinctively, and joyfully. She would solve complex equations for fun, lose herself in textbooks, and stay up late working through problems that excited her more than any movie or social event ever could. Her parents, though they didn't fully understand her gift, supported her with everything they had. They worked long hours, saving every penny, hoping one day their daughter could break the cycle of struggle that had defined their lives. That dream took a major step forward when Evelyn earned a place at Columbia University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the country. It was a moment of pride, not just for her family, but for the entire community. People talked about the girl who had made it, the one who was going to become someone important. At Columbia, Evelyn found herself both in awe and out of place. The campus was beautiful, the professors were brilliant, and the curriculum was as challenging as she had hoped. But it was also a space that constantly reminded her she didn't quite belong, not because of her intelligence, but because of her background and the color of her skin. She was one of the very few black women in the entire department, and the environment, while outwardly polished and professional, was quietly cold. Some students looked at her with doubt, others ignored her altogether. A few professors underestimated her abilities, speaking over her questions or dismissing her insights without a second thought. There were cruel messages left anonymously outside her dorm room, reminders that some still saw her presence as a disruption in a space they believed was only meant for the privileged. Still, Evelyn didn't let those things stop her. She pushed forward, showing up to every class, submitting every assignment with precision, and often outperforming her classmates. Her passion burned bright, and for a while, she truly believed she could rise above the discrimination, the whispered comments, and the long stares. But life, as it often does, had other plans. During her second year, her father suffered a serious injury at work. He was the main provider for the family, and suddenly, everything changed. Medical bills piled up. Her younger siblings needed help. The cost of living in New York City grew heavier by the day. Evelyn tried to balance it all: classes, part-time jobs, and sending money home, but it became too much. She fell behind, not in performance, but in stability. And stability, she realized, was something she couldn't afford to take for granted. Eventually, with a heavy heart, Evelyn made the painful decision to leave Columbia. She withdrew quietly, not even telling some of her closest classmates. The shame of walking away from a dream she had worked so hard for was something she carried in silence. There were no farewell parties, no professors encouraging her to return, just an empty dorm room and a final walk through the gates of a school that had never truly welcomed her. In her heart, she made a promise to return one day, to reclaim the part of her that had been left behind in those cold lecture halls and dimly lit libraries. But as the years passed and the responsibilities of life multiplied, that promise slowly faded into the background. Evelyn took whatever job she could to support her family: waitressing, cleaning, factory work. Eventually, she found the janitorial position at Lincoln High. It offered stability, benefits, and the chance to work early mornings so she could be home in the evenings to care for her aging mother. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of, but it was honest work. Still, not a day went by that she didn't think about those chalkboards, those lectures, those dreams of one day solving real mathematical problems that mattered. She kept her notebooks, stored away in a small box at home, faded pages filled with equations, scribbles, and problem sets she had created for herself just to stay sharp. Sometimes, after a long day, she would pull them out, flip through them, and allow herself a few minutes to feel what it was like to be that girl again, the one who believed she could change the world through numbers. But in public, Evelyn never spoke of her past. She had learned, over time, that people saw what they wanted to see. To them, she was a janitor, not a mathematician. She didn't correct them. She let the world think what it wanted to. After all, what mattered was that she knew who she was, even if no one else did. And while her dream of being a world-renowned mathematician had been deferred, it had never truly died. It simply waited, quietly, patiently, for a moment when it could rise again. Thomas Bennett was everything the school brochures liked to showcase: well-educated, sharply dressed, and confident to the point of intimidation. He taught advanced calculus at Lincoln High School, and his reputation for brilliance traveled far beyond the school's quiet suburban boundaries. Students admired his mind, feared his tests, and followed his every word in the classroom as if they were attending an elite college seminar. But beneath the surface of his accolades and perfect posture was something much colder: an arrogance that had slowly grown unchecked, and a deeply rooted bias he never dared to acknowledge, even to himself. Thomas wasn't outwardly cruel. He didn't use slurs, didn't raise his voice, and never got into heated confrontations. But he carried himself with a quiet certainty that some people were simply beneath him, intellectually, socially, and, though he would never admit it, racially. He had grown up in a world where success was tied to pedigree, where worth was determined by credentials and appearances, and where certain assumptions about people were passed down through tone, tradition, and subtle suggestion. And he had absorbed it all without ever questioning the cost. In the faculty lounge, he rarely mingled with other staff members unless they were part of the academic elite, science, math, maybe a few from the debate team. He had little patience for small talk and even less for what he viewed as non-essential staff. Janitors, cafeteria workers, even the front desk secretary. He saw them, but he didn't see them. They were part of the backdrop that kept the school clean and running, but to Thomas, they weren't really part of the Lincoln High intellectual ecosystem. And among them, Evelyn Carter, the quiet older janitor, barely registered. Evelyn always moved quietly, efficiently. She didn't ask for anything and didn't interrupt. But something about her calm presence in his classroom, especially when she came in to clean during his prep period, bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. Maybe it was her silence. Maybe it was her eyes, which always looked composed, almost knowing. Or maybe it was just that she reminded him of how deep his own prejudices ran. And rather than confront that discomfort, Thomas did what many do. He mocked what he didn't understand. That day in class started like any other. The students were hunched over their desks, attempting to solve a nearly impossible calculus problem he had written on the board. It was the kind of equation designed to challenge even the most advanced minds, and Thomas took pleasure in watching them squirm just a bit. He liked the pressure, the quiet dominance of knowing he held knowledge others didn't. When Evelyn entered the room to sweep up some chalk dust, she did so as she always did, quiet, respectful, hoping not to disturb anyone. But this time, Thomas noticed her. Not just as background, but as an opportunity. There was something about the way she moved, steady and calm, that irritated him more than usual. Maybe it was a rough day. Maybe his ego had been bruised by a student's success the day before. Maybe he just wanted to feel in control again. And so he called her out. Not kindly, not playfully, but with that thin, cutting tone that dressed humiliation in politeness. He challenged her to solve the problem on the board, fully expecting it would embarrass her, that she'd stammer, apologize, and disappear back into the shadows. His students laughed, the kind of laugh that fills the room with discomfort masked as humor. It wasn't just about math anymore. It was about power. About hierarchy. About reminding everyone in that room who was important, and who wasn't. He didn't expect her to actually accept. He certainly didn't expect her to approach the board with steady hands and quiet confidence. And as she picked up the chalk, something in his chest tightened. It was the first time in a long while that Thomas Bennett felt unsure of himself. But his pride held strong. He folded his arms, leaned back and smirked, pretending it was all still under his control. What followed would unravel everything he thought he knew about people like Evelyn. Stroke by stroke, her writing filled the board. Her mind, still sharp after all these years, moved fluidly through the problem, navigating each step with clarity and ease. And with every number she wrote, every symbol she placed, the ground beneath Thomas's sense of superiority began to crack. He watched in silence, his students stunned beside him, as the janitor he had once thought of as invisible exposed not just the solution to his toughest equation, but the smallness of his own assumptions. The laughter in the room had long since faded. No one moved. No one dared to speak. They were all watching Evelyn, and more importantly, they were all watching him. In those quiet minutes, Thomas Bennett began to understand something he had spent his whole life avoiding. Intelligence had nothing to do with job titles. Worth had nothing to do with social status. And dignity, true dignity, wasn't found in a polished appearance or a prestigious degree, but in the calm strength of someone who carried both silence and brilliance with equal grace. He didn't know it then, but this moment would mark the beginning of his own transformation. A journey not just toward humility, but toward redemption. Because the truth is, sometimes the most important lessons don't come from textbooks. They come from the people we least expect, at the exact moment we most need to be taught. When Evelyn Carter stepped toward the chalkboard that day, the air in the classroom shifted. What had started as a joke, cruel and careless, had suddenly taken a sharp, silent turn. The room, moments earlier filled with mocking laughter, was now breathless. Students sat frozen, unsure of what they were witnessing. Their eyes followed every step Evelyn took, their minds struggling to reconcile the image they'd always had of her with what was now unfolding right in front of them. She walked with a quiet steadiness, not hurried, not hesitant. Her grip on the chalk was firm but calm, like it was something familiar, something she had held many times before, and in truth she had. Though it had been decades since she last solved an equation in a classroom, Evelyn hadn't forgotten the rhythm of mathematics. The language of logic, symmetry, and possibility had never left her. It had only been tucked away, waiting patiently for a moment like this. Thomas Bennet, still standing at the side of the room, arms crossed in smug defiance, was the only one trying to pretend he wasn't affected. But even he felt the unease creeping in. His smirk didn't feel as secure anymore. He watched Evelyn, expecting her to fumble, to freeze, to confirm the role he'd written for her in his mind. But Evelyn didn't fumble. She began writing, slow at first, each stroke of chalk deliberate, exact. She analyzed the equation quietly, her eyes scanning its complexity, pulling from the depth of knowledge she'd once had to fight so hard to gain. Then she moved faster. Her mind warmed up like a long idle engine reigniting, and the numbers began to flow. Her hands remembered what her life had tried to forget. Each line she added to the board felt like a piece of herself returning to the surface. For Evelyn, this wasn't just about solving a math problem. This was about reclaiming a part of her identity, about showing herself, and everyone in that room, who she truly was underneath the quiet uniform and invisible label they had placed on her. The students watched in stunned silence. They had never seen anyone solve this problem, not even the top students in the class. What was once considered unsolvable was now unraveling right before their eyes. And it was the janitor doing it, the woman they had ignored every day in the hallway, the one they had never thought twice about. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting toward Bennet, then back to the board. No one laughed now. No one dared. Evelyn worked her way through the solution with grace and precision. She didn't speak, didn't look around the room. Her focus was entirely on the equation, on the truth of it, the elegance of each step fitting into the next. To her, solving the problem wasn't just about proving something. It was like breathing again after years underwater. And as the final line of her solution appeared on the board, clear and correct, a wave of awe washed over the classroom. She paused for a moment, taking it all in. Then she gently placed the chalk down and turned to face the class. The transformation in the room was palpable. Faces once filled with amusement or disinterest were now wide-eyed, silent, some even ashamed. No one knew what to say, because no one expected what they had just seen. Thomas Bennet looked pale, his usual confidence drained. The expression on his face was a mix of disbelief and something deeper, something like guilt. Evelyn's eyes swept across the room, not with anger, but with a quiet knowing. She didn't need applause. She didn't need validation. What she had done spoke louder than any praise ever could. For the first time in years, she had stepped out of the shadows and stood fully in her truth, and the impact of that moment echoed in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. In the seconds that followed, the silence in the room became something sacred. No one dared to break it, not out of fear, but out of respect. Evelyn had just redefined everything they thought they knew. About intelligence. About dignity. About who deserves to be seen. She had turned a cruel joke into a defining moment, not by fighting back with anger, but by standing tall in her strength and letting her brilliance shine. Behind her, the chalkboard was filled with flawless logic. It stood as quiet proof of a life that could have gone a different way, a life filled with academic conferences, university lectures, and published papers. But instead, that life had been buried under layers of prejudice and hardship. And yet, Evelyn hadn't let it go to waste. She had held on to it, even when no one else believed in her, even when the world told her she no longer belonged in rooms of learning and ideas. And now, here she was, showing them all, students, teacher, everyone, that she never stopped being a mathematician. She had simply lived in a world that refused to see her as one. That moment didn't just shift how people saw Evelyn. It cracked something open in each person watching. It made them question how many other Evelyns they had passed by in life. How many people with untold gifts they had ignored, dismissed, or misjudged. Evelyn didn't need to say anything else. Her presence at the front of the room, her calm expression, and the perfect solution behind her were enough. As she stepped back, the students slowly began to process what had happened. Some exchanged glances, others looked down in shame. But all of them, every single one, knew that they had just witnessed something unforgettable. Evelyn Carter had not just solved a math problem. She had solved something much harder. The problem of being seen, of being heard, and of being respected in a world that too often refuses to see beyond the surface. The story of Evelyn Carter solving the impossible math problem didn't stay within the four walls of Thomas Bennett's classroom. Like a spark in a dry forest, it spread quickly, first through whispers in the hallways, then in hushed conversations over lunch, and finally, across the entire campus of Lincoln High School. What had started as a moment meant to humiliate had transformed into something far more powerful, an awakening. Students who had once laughed when Evelyn was mocked now found themselves thinking back to that moment with a mix of disbelief and shame. It wasn't just that she had solved the equation, it was how she had done it. Calmly, without anger, without arrogance. There was no speech, no dramatic gesture. She had simply shown up, solved the problem, and quietly reminded everyone that brilliance doesn't always wear a lab coat or stand at the front of a classroom. Sometimes, it wears a janitor's uniform and walks through the hall before the first bell rings. For many students, especially those who had grown up with the same assumptions Thomas Bennett held, assumptions inherited from generations before them, it was the first time they had been forced to confront their own biases. They started to look at Evelyn differently, yes, but they also began to look at themselves differently. The girl who had snickered from the back of the class couldn't stop thinking about how often she'd passed Evelyn in the hallway without a second thought. The boy who had once joked that Evelyn probably didn't know how to read a textbook now sat in his next class, unable to concentrate, wondering what other assumptions he had been wrong about. There was a visible shift in energy at Lincoln High. The casual, offhand comments about people's jobs or backgrounds, things that once passed without a second glance, now hung heavier in the air. Students started correcting each other, gently at first, then more firmly. Teachers who had stayed silent during moments of exclusion or quiet disrespect began reflecting on their own roles. Evelyn had become, unintentionally, a mirror, one that reflected the quiet prejudice many had allowed to grow unchecked in their school culture. In the days that followed, Evelyn continued her work as usual. She mopped the floors, emptied the trash, and cleaned the classrooms with the same care and dedication she always had. But now, something was different. Students began greeting her, tentatively at first, with soft voices and shy glances. Some offered quiet apologies. Others just nodded respectfully. There were no grand gestures, no sudden declarations of admiration, but the tone had shifted. The respect was real, and it grew quietly with each passing day. A group of students from the math club even started leaving small notes of appreciation on the whiteboard after class. Simple words, "Thank you, Ms. Carter," or "You inspire us," written in marker next to equations. One morning, Evelyn found a cup of coffee waiting for her on the podium with a little sticky note, "You're the real math genius of this school." She smiled, not because she needed the recognition, but because she could feel that the hearts of these young people were beginning to open. The faculty began to take notice too. In a school-wide staff meeting, the principal, Mr. Harris, brought up the incident, not to scold anyone, but to ask important questions. How had they allowed someone like Evelyn to be invisible for so long? What kind of environment had they created where this could happen? And what would they do now to ensure it never happened again? That meeting sparked a series of conversations that began to change the school from the inside out. Committees were formed to address equity and inclusion, not because it was trendy or politically correct, but because it was long overdue. Teachers started integrating stories of underrepresented voices into their lessons. Students were encouraged to reflect on the ways they viewed others, and how those views could shape their actions. For some, it was uncomfortable. Change often is. But discomfort is the beginning of growth, and Lincoln High was growing. Slowly, steadily, the school began to move from being a place that tolerated difference to a place that respected and celebrated it. Even Thomas Bennett, who had built much of his identity on control and intellectual superiority, began to change. His usual cold demeanor softened. He spoke less in meetings and listened more. He started showing up to student-led discussions about bias and privilege, not as a speaker, but as a learner. He no longer strutted through the halls with the same proud posture. Instead, he walked with quiet reflection, offering Evelyn a polite nod whenever their paths crossed, a gesture that held more meaning than any apology ever could. What happened in that one math class became more than just a viral moment or a story shared over lunch. It became a turning point, a lived lesson that no textbook could ever teach. Evelyn Carter had shown them all that brilliance can exist in places they never thought to look, and that respect is something we owe to others not because of their job or title, but because of their humanity. Lincoln High didn't become perfect overnight. There were still moments when old habits surfaced, when people forgot the lesson. But something had shifted at its core. And once a seed like that is planted, watered by humility, nurtured by courage, it keeps growing. The students, the teachers, even the administration began to carry themselves with a little more grace, a little more thoughtfulness. They started asking themselves the hard questions before judging others. And more importantly, they started listening, truly listening, to voices they had once ignored. All because one woman, with quiet strength and a piece of chalk, reminded them what dignity really looks like. In the days following Evelyn Carter's quiet but unforgettable moment at the chalkboard, something began to shift inside Thomas Bennett. On the outside, he tried to carry on as usual, lecturing with his usual polish, assigning challenging problems, maintaining the air of confidence and authority that had long defined his presence at Lincoln High. But something deep within him had changed. It started as a discomfort he couldn't shake, a persistent tightness in his chest every time he thought about that moment in class. The memory of Evelyn solving his most difficult problem with such quiet mastery returned to him again and again, each time unraveling another layer of certainty he had once wrapped tightly around himself. He had spent his career believing in a clear structure, a hierarchy of intellect and value, with himself comfortably near the top. He had always prided himself on being logical, objective, fair. But now he couldn't help but question whether he had been any of those things. Logic had never taught him to look down on someone because of their job. Objectivity didn't justify dismissing someone based on their appearance. Fairness wasn't asking someone to solve an equation as a joke to shame them. The truth was, what he had done to Evelyn that day was driven not by reason, but by a blind spot he had never been willing to admit: his own prejudice. The worst part wasn't that he had misjudged her intelligence. It was that he had treated her like she didn't matter. He had turned a living, breathing person into the punchline of a classroom stunt, thinking it was harmless, even clever. But there was nothing clever about humiliation. There was nothing harmless about using power to belittle someone. And now, the guilt sat heavy on his shoulders. Thomas found himself watching Evelyn from a distance as she moved through the hallways in the early mornings. She hadn't changed at all. She still carried her cleaning cart with the same quiet diligence, still wore the same faded uniform and warm, steady expression. But the way others looked at her had changed. Students now stepped aside for her in the hallway. Some offered warm greetings. A few even stayed behind after school to chat with her, ask her questions, or simply offer help carrying supplies. And Thomas noticed that Evelyn didn't bask in the attention. She simply accepted it with her usual grace, as though none of it had ever been about recognition, but something much deeper. One afternoon, after wrestling with his thoughts for far too long, Thomas made his way toward the janitor's closet at the far end of the east wing. His heart beat faster than he expected as he approached the door. The hallway was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hear your own breath. He stopped in front of the door and gently knocked. Evelyn opened it slowly, surprised but composed. Her eyes, as always, were kind and observant. Thomas hesitated for a moment, not knowing exactly what to say. He had spoken thousands of words in his career, explaining formulas, grading essays, lecturing on principles, but none of them had ever felt as difficult to deliver as the simple ones he needed now. He stepped inside the small, cramped space, surrounded by the smell of cleaning supplies and the hum of a dusty ventilation fan. And then he did something he hadn't done in years. He let his guard down. He looked Evelyn in the eye and admitted he was wrong. He acknowledged what he had done and, more importantly, what it had meant. He didn't try to explain it away. He didn't soften the impact. He simply apologized. Evelyn listened, quiet and still, allowing him the space to speak. When she finally responded, it wasn't with anger or resentment, but with honesty. She told him what it felt like to be invisible for so long, to carry knowledge that no one cared to discover, to be treated as though her role in the building defined her entire worth. She spoke gently but firmly, her voice steady with decades of unspoken truth. And Thomas listened, truly listened, for perhaps the first time in his life. That conversation stayed with him. It didn't erase the past, but it marked the beginning of something new. He began making small changes in how he taught, how he spoke, how he carried himself. He made space in his lessons to highlight voices that had long been excluded: black mathematicians, women in science, underrepresented thinkers. He led conversations with his students about what happened in his classroom, encouraging them to reflect on their own assumptions and how they treated others. He didn't do any of it to earn forgiveness. He knew some things couldn't be undone. But he also knew that change doesn't begin with perfection. It begins with humility. And in Evelyn's strength, he had seen the kind of dignity he now wanted to live by. In time, the other teachers noticed the difference in him. He was quieter now, not in a withdrawn way, but in a thoughtful one. He didn't command attention the way he used to. Instead, he invited participation, gave more room for questions, and seemed less concerned with being right and more focused on being real. His students respected him not just for his knowledge, but for his growth. They saw a man who had been challenged and had chosen to change. And in doing so, Thomas Bennett became something far more valuable than a brilliant teacher. He became an example, a reminder that even those who fall can rise again, not by defending their pride, but by choosing to learn, to listen, and to grow. And all of that began with one moment, one lesson he never expected to learn, from the quiet woman he never expected to teach him. Principal David Harris had spent nearly 20 years at Lincoln High School, guiding it through curriculum changes, staff turnovers, and the never-ending challenges of adolescence. He took pride in maintaining a school that was known for its academic excellence and polished public image. On paper, Lincoln High stood tall: high test scores, clean facilities, respectable college acceptance rates. But what Evelyn Carter's story quietly exposed was something deeper, something that had been hiding in plain sight for years. And when David heard what happened in Thomas Bennett's class, he knew immediately that this moment couldn't be brushed aside. At first, like many others, he was stunned. The story made its way to his office not through official channels, but through the kind of murmurs that move quickly when something truly meaningful happens. Students talked. Teachers reflected. Staff members who had worked alongside Evelyn for years now looked at her with fresh, humbled eyes. He heard one student say they'd never been more moved in a classroom, not by the problem itself, but by the woman who solved it and the grace with which she did. David found himself staring out his office window that afternoon, watching the last of the students filter out toward the buses. His school was changing. Something had been stirred awake. And as a leader, he knew this wasn't just a teachable moment, it was a defining one. He couldn't stay quiet. He had to act. But how? What could he do to honor Evelyn in a way that was sincere, not performative? The answer, surprisingly, felt simple. Give her the recognition she always deserved. Later that week, he made his way down to the east wing of the school, past the rows of lockers and into the small storage room that Evelyn used between shifts. He knocked gently, waited, and when she opened the door, he saw the same calm eyes he'd passed in the hallways for years. This time, though, he really saw them. And he saw the weight those eyes had carried without complaint. David didn't come with grand speeches or a formal proposal. He just spoke from the heart. He told her how the school had changed since that day. How students were speaking differently, thinking differently. How teachers had started looking inward in ways they never had before. He told her that her story had become more than just a story. It had become a turning point. Then, gently and with great respect, he asked her something he had never imagined asking before. Would she consider joining the math faculty at Lincoln High, even part-time? Would she stand at the front of a classroom, not as someone cleaning up after others, but as someone sharing the knowledge and wisdom she had kept tucked away for decades? Evelyn didn't respond right away. She looked at him quietly, her eyes thoughtful, and David could tell she was measuring more than just the offer. She was remembering, feeling, wondering. After a long pause, she spoke, softly, but with deep clarity. She told him that the offer meant more than he probably realized. That when she was young, she had dreamed of a life just like that, of classrooms and chalkboards and students who looked up to her not because of what she wore, but because of what she knew. She shared how life had taken her in a different direction, how those dreams had been set aside not because she lacked the will, but because the world didn't give her room to keep going. And then she said something David would never forget. She told him that she didn't need a title to feel fulfilled. That while the classroom was once her dream, she had found peace in her work, not because it was easy, but because it had taught her strength. She had learned that a person's worth doesn't come from where they stand, but from how they stand. And in her own quiet way, she had already taught more than she ever imagined. David listened, humbled by her words. He understood. Her refusal wasn't rejection, it was grace. She wasn't declining because she didn't believe she could do it, but because she no longer needed to prove anything. Her story had already spoken volumes, and it had already started changing hearts. Before he left, she thanked him for listening, for recognizing her. And she asked just one thing, that the school continue growing. That the momentum this moment sparked wouldn't fade. That the young people walking these halls would keep learning to see beyond appearances. And most of all, that dignity and kindness would become as central to their education as math or science ever could be. David promised her it would. And he meant it. After that conversation, he walked back to his office with a renewed sense of responsibility. Not just as a principal, but as a human being. He began meeting with department heads to discuss more inclusive teaching practices. He approved student-led forums on race and equity. He made room in the school's weekly bulletin to highlight stories of resilience and humanity from every corner of the building. Not just from the top students or winning sports teams, but from custodians, cafeteria workers, library aides, everyone. And even though Evelyn continued her work as a janitor, everyone knew she was something more. The students began calling her Professor Carter, with a smile, half in jest, half in reverence. She would chuckle quietly, but she never corrected them. Because in their eyes, and in the hearts of those who had watched her change an entire school without saying much at all, that's exactly who she was. She was the teacher who never needed a podium. The one who turned humility into power. The one who reminded them all that greatness has no uniform, and that true wisdom sometimes walks through the door with a mop in hand and a past full of silent brilliance. Principal Harris would later tell people that Evelyn didn't just teach math that day, she taught the whole school how to be better. Evelyn Carter never asked to be remembered. She never set out to make history or change a school. She came to work each day with a quiet sense of duty, carrying her mop and cart through the same hallways, cleaning the same classrooms, and living her life with quiet resilience. But sometimes the most powerful legacies aren't built by people chasing recognition. They're created by those who live with grace, integrity, and the kind of quiet strength that lingers long after the moment has passed. After the day she solved the unsolvable math problem, things at Lincoln High didn't just shift, they transformed. It didn't happen all at once, and it didn't look flashy. There were no banners or assemblies in her honor, no trophies or plaques. What happened was deeper, more permanent. A ripple effect that moved gently but powerfully through the heart of the school and into the surrounding community. Students began to look at their world through a different lens. They became more curious, not just about equations and facts, but about the people around them. They started asking themselves what stories they had missed, what assumptions they had made, and what silent talents had gone unnoticed. They began seeing the lunch staff, the janitors, and the office aides as people worth knowing, not just roles filling space. They held doors open longer. They said thank you more often. And when they spoke, it was with a little more kindness, a little more thought. Teachers, too, found themselves reevaluating their roles, not just as educators of subjects, but as shapers of character. Evelyn's story reminded them that every interaction mattered, that respect didn't begin and end with grades, and that the greatest lessons sometimes came from places far outside the curriculum. They started talking more openly about race, bias, and the quiet systems that had allowed certain students and staff to feel invisible for far too long. Principal David Harris stayed true to his promise. Under his leadership, Lincoln High began implementing regular forums and classroom discussions centered on equity, identity, and inclusion. A student-led initiative was launched, giving voice to those who had previously felt left out of the school's narrative. Clubs were formed, mentorships were built, and books by underrepresented voices started appearing in classrooms where they'd never been included before. Outside the school walls, Evelyn's impact reached further than anyone expected. Parents began hearing about what had happened in Mr. Bennett's classroom, not just the math problem, but the transformation that followed. Local newspapers picked up the story. Then nearby schools started reaching out, curious to know more. What began as one woman's quiet moment of courage soon became a living example of how a single act of dignity could inspire a community to grow. Other schools began replicating Lincoln High's approach, introducing programs focused on empathy, respect, and discovering untold stories. They created platforms for custodial staff, cafeteria workers, and transportation teams to share their experiences with students. They encouraged moments of connection that hadn't existed before, bridging gaps that had once felt permanent. Evelyn, for her part, didn't change how she lived. She still came to school early each morning. She still worked with care and intention, wiping down whiteboards and sweeping floors before the first bell rang. When students greeted her, she responded with her familiar warm smile, never acting as though she was anything more than who she'd always been. And maybe that's why her story stuck. She didn't chase the spotlight. She didn't demand to be heard. She simply did what she had always done, showed up with quiet excellence, and let her character speak for itself. Eventually, her story became part of Lincoln High's culture. New students learned about her on their first day of school. Not in a textbook, but through conversations passed down by upperclassmen who'd been there to witness it. She became a symbol, not of perfection, but of possibility. A reminder that we never really know who someone is just by looking. That kindness is never wasted. That the most profound intelligence often goes unnoticed until the world finally pauses to listen. Even Thomas Bennett, who had once been the source of her public humiliation, became one of her most consistent supporters. He changed, not because he had to, but because he chose to. He used his story to teach humility to his students, not shying away from the mistakes he had made. He spoke openly about the dangers of silent prejudice, and the importance of looking inward. He never asked Evelyn for public forgiveness. He didn't need to. The way he carried himself in the years that followed was all the apology she ever needed. As for Evelyn, her legacy became less about a single math problem and more about what it uncovered. How easily we overlook the brilliance in people when we limit our view to what we expect. Her life reminded everyone at Lincoln that greatness doesn't have one shape. It doesn't always stand on a stage or wear a title. Sometimes it wears work boots, carries a bucket, and walks with the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly who they are. Years later, long after she had retired, her story still lived on. There was a mural painted near the library, nothing flashy, just an image of her standing in front of a chalkboard, a piece of white chalk in her hand, her eyes calm and strong. Underneath it read a simple message that echoed in every hallway of the school. Respect is earned in silence, but remembered in legacy. And so, Evelyn Carter, the janitor no one noticed, became the teacher no one could forget. Not because she demanded attention, but because she reminded everyone that every person carries something extraordinary, if only we take the time to see it. Evelyn Carter's story reminds us that true worth isn't defined by job titles, outward appearance, or social status. It lies in character, resilience, and the quiet dignity with which we live our lives. Many older adults, especially those who have lived through silent sacrifices, unspoken struggles, or careers that were not celebrated, may find in Evelyn's journey a reflection of their own strength. It's a powerful lesson that our value doesn't fade with time or go unnoticed forever. The wisdom, experience, and talents we carry, though often hidden, can become sources of transformation, not just for ourselves, but for the people and communities around us. Evelyn didn't demand respect. She earned it through grace, humility, and courage. Her legacy teaches us that it's never too late to reclaim our voice, to remind the world, and ourselves, of the light we carry. We all have a story worth sharing, a lesson worth teaching, and a life worth honoring. So whether you're in your 50s, 60s, or beyond, remember, your presence still matters, your gifts still shine, and your journey is still unfolding. We'd love to hear from you. What part of Evelyn's story touched you the most? Have you ever felt overlooked or underestimated, and how did you rise above it? Leave a comment below and share your wisdom. You never know who you might inspire today. And if this story moved you, please give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for more powerful, heartwarming stories that celebrate the quiet heroes among us. Goodbye.